Chapter 1. Introduction. The Enigma of Genius. The history of Western music contains few names that carry the weight, the mythos, and the sheer electric charge of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. To speak his name is to conjure an image of divine inspiration, of a conduit through which the music of the spheres flowed effortlessly onto parchment. Yet, as we stand on the precipice of this biographical journey, we must first dismantle the statue to find the man. We begin not with a birth, but with a silence. It is the 5th of December, 1791. In a modest apartment on the Rauhensteingasse in Vienna, a 35-year-old man lies dead. The cause is listed as severe miliary fever, though rumours of poison, of aqua tofana administered by jealous rivals, will soon whisper through the coffee houses of the Habsburg capital. These rumours are almost certainly false, the product of a dramatic age seeking a dramatic end for its greatest protagonist. The reality is far more clinical, yet no less tragic. The man who had charmed empresses and kings, who had redefined the limits of human creativity, died not in the dramatic throes of a murder plot, but in the exhausted grip of illness, his body worn down by a life lived at a pace that defied nature. There is perhaps no figure in the artistic canon more obscured by the fog of legend than Mozart. The popular imagination paints him as an eternal child, a giggling vessel of God who dictated symphonies without correction, buried eventually in a pauper's grave amidst a raging blizzard. This narrative, while cinematic, serves to distance us from the true magnitude of his achievement. It suggests that his genius was accidental, a gift bestowed rather than a skill honed. The documentary evidence tells a different, more compelling story. The unmarked grave in the St. Mark's Cemetery was not a sign of abject poverty or disrespect, but a reflection of the rationalist burial reforms instituted by Emperor Joseph II. The blizzard was a later invention of Romantic biographers. Meteorological records from 1791 suggest a calm, albeit damp, Viennese night. And the music? The music was the result of a ferocious, almost terrifying work ethic that began before the boy could properly hold a quill. Consider the numbers, for they are staggering. In a lifespan of merely 35 years, Mozart produced over 600 catalogued works. This output, organised methodically in the 19th century by Ludwig von Köchel, encompasses 41 symphonies, 27 piano concertos, 5 violin concertos, 22 operas, and a vast array of chamber music, masses, and sonatas. It is not merely the volume that arrests the historian, it is the consistency of the evolution. From the tentative scratches of a 5-year-old in Salzburg to the metaphysical depth of the Requiem in Vienna, there is a continuous, unbroken line of ascent. He composed while travelling in rattling carriages over frozen, European roads. He composed in crowded billiard rooms. He composed while his wife was ill and his creditors were knocking at the door. To view Mozart solely as a divinely inspired vessel is to rob him of his humanity and his resilience. He was a man of the Enlightenment, deeply interested in the intellectual currents of his time, a Freemason seeking brotherhood and truth, and a professional musician navigating a treacherous transition from feudal servitude to freelance independence. This series will attempt to navigate the labyrinth of the Mozart family correspondence, a treasure trove of thousands of letters that offer an unfiltered window into their world. Through these letters, we encounter not the porcelain doll of the souvenir shops, but a complex, often contradictory human being. We find a man who possessed a crude, scatological sense of humour that has baffled conservative scholars for centuries. We find a son locked in a lifelong psychological struggle with a domineering, ambitious father. We find a husband capable of profound tenderness and paralysing anxiety. But above all, we find a mind that processed the world through sound. To understand Mozart is to understand a brain that seemingly never slept, a cognitive engine that was constantly arranging, rearranging, and perfecting musical structures, even in the midst of mundane conversation. Over the course of the next 12 chapters, we will trace this trajectory with strict adherence to historical fact, stripping away the varnish of the 19th century romanticists who sought to turn him into a tragic saint. We will walk the streets of mid-18th century Salzburg, a small ecclesiastical principality where the archbishop held absolute sway. We will endure the grueling conditions of the Grand Tour, where a small boy was paraded before the courts of London, Paris and Vienna like a scientific curiosity. We will analyse the pivotal moments of rebellion, the calculated risks, and the devastating failures that marked his quest for employment. We will dissect the music, not just as aesthetic objects, but as biographical documents that reveal his inner emotional state more accurately than any diary entry. It is essential to understand the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the era. Europe in the mid-18th century was a patchwork of shifting alliances and fading empires. The Enlightenment was challenging the old orders of church and monarchy. Science, reason, and individual liberty were the talking points of the intelligentsia. Mozart was not merely a musician. He was a product of this shifting world. His operas, particularly The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, were not just entertainment. They were subversive commentaries on class and morality. He was an artist attempting to assert his individual worth in a society that viewed musicians as little more than skilled servants, ranking just above the cooks and the valets. His struggle was not just artistic, it was social and economic. Why does he remain such an enigma? Perhaps it's because his music manages to be two things at once, universally accessible and infinitely complex. A child can hum the melody of Eine kleine Nachtmusik, yet music theorists spend lifetimes unravelling the harmonic intricacies of the Jupiter Symphony. His music reflects the totality of human experience, joy, sorrow, wit, despair, and transcendence, often within the span of a few bars. As we embark on this examination of his life, we must remain objective. We must resist the urge to deify him, for his flaws are as significant as his gifts. His financial mismanagement, his occasional arrogance, and his mercurial temperament are all pieces of the puzzle. But it is in the friction between his flawed humanity and his artistic perfection that the true spark of his genius is found. So, let us turn back the clock. Let us leave the sombre atmosphere of 1791 Vienna and the unfinished Requiem. Let us erase the tragedy that we know is coming. We must return to a time when the world was quiet, before the arrival of the phenomenon that would change music forever. We travel south and west, through the mountains of Austria, to a house on the Getreidegasse in Salzburg. The year is 1756. It is January. Leopold Mozart, a violinist and minor composer in the service of the Prince Archbishop, is about to welcome his seventh child into the world. He does not yet know that this child will render his own name immortal, nor does he know the tumultuous, brilliant and heartbreaking path that lies ahead. The stage is set. The enigma is about to be born. Chapter 2. Salzburg's Wunderkind, 1756-1762. The 27th of January, 1756. Salzburg, an independent ecclesiastical principality within the Holy Roman Empire, lay gripped by the icy teeth of an Alpine winter. In the narrow winding artery of the Getreidegasse, inside the building marked number 9, a life began that would alter the trajectory of Western art forever. In a modest third-floor apartment, Anna Maria Mozart gave birth to a son. He was christened the following day in the chaotic splendour of Salzburg Cathedral as Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart. To his family, he was simply Wolfgang. But the atmosphere surrounding this birth was not merely one of celebration, it was fraught with the tension of survival. Leopold and Anna Maria had already buried 5 children in infancy. Only one other child, a daughter named Maria Anna, known as Annals, had survived the perilous first years. The arrival of Wolfgang was a gamble against the grim statistics of the 18th century, a fragile spark in a cold world. To understand the phenomenon of the sun, one must first dissect the father. Leopold Mozart was no ordinary provincial musician. He was the son of a bookbinder, a man of sharp intellect, deep piety, and rigid ambition. In the very year of Wolfgang's birth, Leopold published his Versuch einer gründlichen Violinschule, a comprehensive treatise on violin playing that established him as a pedagogue of European renown. He was a man of logic, order, and the Enlightenment, believing fervently that talent was a raw material to be sculpted through relentless discipline. He served as the Vice-Kapellmeister, the Prince Archbishop, a position of respectability, yet he harboured a simmering frustration with the limitations of his station. He could not have known, as he looked down at the infant in the cradle, that his own career as a composer was effectively over. His life's work would not be the symphonies he penned, but the child he would mould. The domestic scene in the Mozart household was dominated by music. It was the air the children breathed. By the time Wolfgang was 3 years old, the house resonated with the sound of the harpsichord. His sister Annals, 5 years his senior, was already displaying a remarkable aptitude for the instrument under Leopold's tutelage. The toddler, barely tall enough to see the keys, would stand transfixed, watching her fingers dance. It was here, in the shadow of his sister, that the first anomaly occurred. It was not merely imitation, it was an obsessive compulsion. The 3-year-old Wolfgang began to climb onto the bench the moment Annals vacated it. He did not bang on the keys in the manner of a typical child. Instead, he sought logic. He spent hours happily picking out thirds, delighting in the consonance and the harmony. He was searching for order in the sound. Leopold observed this with a watchful, perhaps unsettling intensity. He began to introduce the boy to the fundamentals of the clavier in a game-like manner, but the game quickly turned into something far more serious. The speed of the boy's acquisition of knowledge was terrifyingly rapid. It defied the natural laws of pedagogy. Concepts that took months for a talented student to grasp were absorbed by the 4-year-old Wolfgang in moments. He possessed an uncanny auditory memory and a rhythmic precision that bordered on the mechanical, yet it was infused with a profound emotional sensitivity. By the age of 4, he was learning short pieces, minuets, and scherzos, executing them with flawless correctness and perfect timing. The learning process for a single piece took barely half an hour. The father, a man of devout Catholic faith, began to view his son not merely as a prodigy, but as a divine miracle, a responsibility entrusted to him by God, which he was duty-bound to cultivate to its absolute limit. The transition from interpreter to creator happened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. In early 1761, at the age of 5, Wolfgang picked up a quill. He did not just play music, he began to hear it in his head and felt the compulsion to externalize it. His first documented compositions, the Andante in C major and the Allegro in C major, were entered into Annals' music notebook by Leopold. These were not the chaotic scribblings of a child, but structurally sound musical sentences. They adhered to the strict rules of binary form. While simple, they betrayed a terrifying maturity. The phrasing was balanced, the harmony was correct. Leopold, the strict theorist, found nothing to correct. The child was channeling the musical grammar of the era as if it were his native tongue, learned before he could even write words. A pivotal moment, one that crystallized the sheer magnitude of this genius, occurred when Wolfgang was roughly 5 or 6. It is an anecdote recorded by the court trumpeter Johann Andreas Schachtner, a close friend of the family. Schachtner and Leopold entered the house to find the boy busy with a pen and a sheet of paper. He was smeared with ink, his fingers, his face, the table. When Leopold asked what he was doing, the boy replied that he was writing a concerto for the clavier. Leopold, expecting a childish mess, initially laughed at the smudges and the chaotic appearance of the page. But as he picked up the paper and began to study the notes emerging from the ink blots, the laughter died in his throat. He stared at the page for a long time, tears beginning to stream down his face. He passed the paper to Schachtner. "Look, Herr Schachtner," he whispered, his voice trembling. "See how everything is composed according to the rules and with the right notes." The piece was technically so difficult that no one could play it, a fact the child disputed, insisting it just needed practice. It was a composition of immense complexity, written by a child who could barely hold the pen without making a mess. This incident marked a psychological turning point for Leopold. The realization hit him with the force of a revelation. His son was superior to him. The teacher had been eclipsed by the student before the student had even lost his milk teeth. Leopold's ambition shifted gears. He saw a destiny that extended far beyond the provincial borders of Salzburg. The town, with its rigid social hierarchy and limited court, was too small a vessel for such a talent. If Wolfgang was indeed a miracle, as Leopold believed, then it was a miracle that must be proclaimed to the world. It was not enough for the boy to be the wonder of the Getreidegasse. He had to become the wonder of Europe. By 1762, the atmosphere in the Mozart household had changed from domestic tutelage to strategic preparation. The rigorous training intensified. Leopold suspended his own composing almost entirely. Every waking hour was dedicated to the education of Wolfgang and Annals. They were drilled not just in music, but in languages, mathematics, and etiquette. They were being groomed for the aristocracy. The childhood of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, if it ever truly existed, was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the regimen of a professional virtuoso. The father had a plan. He would take his children to Munich, to Vienna, to the courts of kings and emperors. He would show them the miracle of Salzburg. As the winter of 1762 approached, the 6-year-old Wolfgang stood at the precipice of a life that would be consumed by travel, performance, and the relentless pressure to astound. He was a small, pale child, prone to illness, yet possessed of a frighteningly intense gaze and a mind that never rested. The Wunderkind was ready. The quiet years in Salzburg were over. The road lay ahead, paving the way for a journey that would ultimately destroy the child to immortalize the genius. Chapter 3. The Grand European Tour, 1763-1766. On the 9th of June, 1763, the carriage wheels of the Mozart family ground against the cobblestones of Salzburg, marking the beginning of an odyssey that would define the 18th century musical landscape. This was not merely a journey. It was a calculated campaign of conquest, orchestrated by Leopold Mozart. His objective was to parade his two prodigies, 7-year-old Wolfgang and 12-year-old Annals, before the absolute monarchs and discerning aristocracy of Western Europe. The family would not see their home again for 3.5 years. The physical reality of such a tour in the 1760s was brutal. The roads were often little more than rutted tracks of mud and stone, punishing the suspension of horse-drawn carriages and the spines of their passengers. For a child as sensitive as Wolfgang, the constant vibration, the stifling dust of summer, and the biting damp of winter posed a perpetual threat to his fragile constitution. Yet, the initial leg of the tour through Munich, Augsburg, and Ludwigsburg proceeded with the relentless momentum of a military march. Leopold, acting as agent, press secretary, and valet, managed every detail, from the tuning of harpsichords to the procurement of letters of introduction. By November 1763, the Mozarts arrived in Paris, the cultural epicenter of Europe. Here, the sheer scale of their ambition became apparent. They were granted access to the Palace of Versailles, navigating the labyrinthine politics of the French court to perform for King Louis XV. It was a world of rigid etiquette, yet the 7-year-old Wolfgang navigated it with an unnerving lack of inhibition. Witnesses reported that the boy stood on a chair to examine the king's face and famously refused to kiss the Madame de Pompadour when she turned away from him, asking aloud why she would not kiss him when the Empress had. But beneath the anecdotes of childish charm lay a rigorous professional development. It was in Paris that Wolfgang published his first works, a set of sonatas for keyboard and violin, designated as Opus 1 and Opus 2. The title page bore the inscription of a 7-year-old author, a marketing stroke by Leopold that cemented the boy's status as a miracle of nature. However, the true crucible of Mozart's early genius awaited across the English Channel. In April 1764, the family endured a nauseating sea crossing to London. The British capital was a sprawling, chaotic metropolis, vastly different from the ordered provincialism of Salzburg or the polished veneer of Paris. Here, the Mozarts were embraced by King George III and Queen Charlotte. The royal couple's genuine enthusiasm for music provided Wolfgang with a safe harbour, but it was a specific encounter in London that would irrevocably alter his musical DNA. He met Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of the great Johann, Sebastian Bach. Johann Christian, known as the London Bach, was a master of the gallant style, music of clarity, charm, and operatic singing lines. The 50-year-old master and the 8-year-old prodigy formed an unlikely bond. They were observed sitting at the keyboard together, the elder Bach playing a bar, the boy playing the next, their improvisations weaving together so seamlessly that listeners believed a single pair of hands was at work. From Johann Christian, Wolfgang absorbed the structural power of the symphony and the expressive nuance of the Italianate melody. It was under this influence, amidst the fog and coal smoke of London, that the 8-year-old composed his first symphonies. The chaotic manuscript of Symphony No. 1 in E-flat major reveals a mind rapidly expanding to fill the orchestral container, mimicking the crescendos and textures he heard in the London opera houses. However, the tour was not a continuous parade of triumph. The scientific curiosity of the Age of Enlightenment demanded proof. The Honourable Daines Barrington, a lawyer and Fellow of the Royal Society, subjected Wolfgang to a series of rigorous tests, sceptical of the boy's reported age and abilities. He suspected Leopold of presenting a dwarf adult as a child. Barrington placed difficult scores before the boy, demanded improvisations on themes of anger and love, and watched for signs of deception. Wolfgang passed every test with terrifying ease, yet would instantly revert to childhood, famously abandoning a complex harpsichord demonstration to chase a cat that ran through the room. Barrington's eventual report to the Royal Society confirmed the boy's genius, but highlighted the jarring dissonance between his musical maturity and his physical immaturity. As the tour dragged into its third year, the physical toll began to manifest with life-threatening severity. In the summer of 1765, the family departed England for the Netherlands. Leopold had been tempted by the lucrative offers from the Dutch court, despite the children being exhausted. It was a gamble that nearly cost him everything. Upon arrival in The Hague, Annals collapsed with typhoid fever. Her condition deteriorated so rapidly that the last rites were administered. King and commoner alike waited for news of her death. Just as she began a miraculous recovery, Wolfgang fell victim to the same disease. For weeks, the boy lay in a delirium, wasted to a skeleton, his tongue parched and blistered. The music stopped. The breathless pace of the tour ground to a halt in a darkened room where Leopold and Anna Maria watched their investment and their beloved son hover on the precipice of oblivion. This brush with mortality cast a long shadow over the remainder of their travels. It was a stark reminder that the vessel containing this supernatural talent was frighteningly mortal. Recovery was slow, but the relentless drive of Leopold Mozart allowed for little convalescence. By early 1766 the family was moving again, travelling back through Paris and Switzerland, performing in cities like Dijon, Lyon and Geneva. The novelty of the Wunderkind was beginning to wear thin in places they had already visited. The boy was growing up, his legs longer, his face less cherubic. The miracle of a 7-year-old playing the clavier was astounding. The same feat performed by a 10-year-old was merely impressive. They arrived back in Salzburg in late November 1766, carrying trunks filled with gifts, snuff boxes, and gold watches, but little actual profit as the expenses of travel had devoured their earnings. Wolfgang was no longer the child who had left 3 years prior. He had seen the great capitals of the world, survived deadly fevers, and absorbed the musical dialects of Germany, France, England, and Italy. He returned to Salzburg not just as a performer, but as a composer with a cosmopolitan ear, already estranged from the provincial limitations of his hometown. The Grand Tour had forged a master, but it had also stolen his childhood, replacing play with performance and stability with the eternal motion of the carriage wheel. Chapter 4, Italian Journeys and Teenage Ambition, 1769 to 1773, December 1769. The carriage wheels groaned against the frozen earth as Leopold Mozart and his 13-year-old son Wolfgang crossed the Brenner Pass. This was not merely another tour, it was a siege. Italy was the undisputed musical capital of the world. To conquer the courts of Europe, one first had to be anointed by the masters of Milan, Bologna, and Rome. For Leopold, the stakes were terrifyingly high. He had invested years of income and energy into cultivating a prodigy, but the novelty of a performing child was fading. Wolfgang was now an adolescent standing on the precipice of adulthood. He could no longer rely on cuteness or parlour tricks. He had to prove himself as a serious composer against the established maestros of the Italian tradition. As they descended into the plains of Lombardy, the air grew warmer, but the pressure intensified. They were entering a chaotic, vibrant, and ruthless artistic arena where foreign reputations meant nothing. Wolfgang had to win them over, note by note. Their first major battleground was Bologna, the intellectual heart of Italian music theory. Here resided Padre Giovanni Battista Martini, a Franciscan friar widely regarded as the supreme authority on counterpoint. A nod from Martini was worth more than gold. It was a passport to legitimacy. In the summer of 1770, the young Mozart was subjected to a rigorous examination. The challenge was severe. Wolfgang was locked in a room at the Accademia Philharmonica, alone, with a specific antiphon to set in 4 parts. It was a test that typically required hours of labour for experienced men. Wolfgang emerged in under an hour, the manuscript flawless. The scepticism of the Accademia elders evaporated. Although their statutes technically forbade the admission of anyone under the age of 20, they unanimously voted to suspend the rules. Wolfgang was inducted as a Knight of the Philharmonic Academy. He was 14 years old. Leopold wrote home in triumph, sensing that the foundation for his son's future employment was being laid in stone. From the academic rigour of Bologna, they moved to the spiritual grandeur of Rome. It was Holy Week, 1770. The city pulsed with pilgrims and incense. In the Sistine Chapel, the papal choir performed the legendary Miserere by Gregorio Allegri. This piece of music was shrouded in mystery and strict prohibition. The Vatican had forbidden the transcription of the score under pain of excommunication. The work was to exist only within those walls, a divine secret. Wolfgang stood in the crowded chapel, listening intently to the 9-part polyphony weaving through the smoky air. He did not take notes, he simply listened. Upon returning to their lodgings, fueled by a mixture of audacity and genius, the boy sat down and wrote the entire score from memory. He returned a day later with the manuscript hidden in his hat to verify his corrections. It was an act of intellectual theft so brilliant that when news reached Pope Clement XIV, there was no punishment. Instead, the pontiff granted Wolfgang the Order of the Golden Spur. The boy from Salzburg was now a cavalier, equal in rank to Gluck and Dittersdorf, yet he possessed no steady income. Honours were vanity. The true currency of Italy was opera seria. In Milan, Wolfgang faced his most critical professional test. a commission to write the opening opera for the carnival season, titled Mithridate Rediponto. The lead-up to the premiere in December 1770 was fraught with sabotage and anxiety. The singers, wary of trusting their reputations to a German teenager, demanded endless rewrites. They whispered that the boy was merely a front for his father, or that he was incapable of capturing the dramatic nuance required for the stage. Wolfgang worked frantically, his quill scratching late into the night, battling illness and the biting Milanese winter. On the 26th of December, the curtain rose at the Teatro Regio Ducal. Wolfgang sat at the harpsichord conducting. The tension in the hall was palpable. 6 hours later, the verdict was delivered not in polite applause, but in raucous cheers. Shouts of "Viva il maestrino!" "Long live the little master!" echoed from the boxes. Mithridate was performed 21 times. It was a triumph that seemed to guarantee a future in Italy. Encouraged by this victory, father and son returned to Milan in 1771 for a second commission, the Serenata Ascanio in Alba, written for the wedding of Archduke Ferdinand. The aging master Johann Adolf Hasse had also written an opera for the occasion, yet it was Mozart's work that captivated the public. Hasse, recognizing the shifting tides of history, reportedly remarked, "This boy will cause us all to be forgotten." Leopold saw an opening. He petitioned Archduke Ferdinand to hire Wolfgang permanently. The Archduke was amenable, but he required his mother's permission. The response from Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna was swift and devastating. In a letter that Leopold would never see, she advised her son against burdening himself with useless people who ran about like beggars. The Habsburg network, which Leopold had courted for a decade, was quietly closing its doors. They viewed the Mozarts not as geniuses to be nurtured, but as itinerant performers to be kept at arm's length. Oblivious to the Empress's secret rejection, they made a third and final journey to Milan in late 1772 for the opera Lucio Silla. The premiere was a disaster of logistics. The performance began 3 hours late. The audience was exhausted and irritable before a note was sung. The tenor was a last-minute replacement, a church singer visibly terrified of the stage. Despite the chaotic start, the music eventually won the audience over, and the run was successful. Yet the silence from the nobility was deafening. No contract was offered. No court position materialized. The grand strategy of the Italian journeys to secure a prestigious post that would free Wolfgang from the provincial limits of Salzburg had failed. The applause was genuine, but it did not translate into security. The realization began to dawn on Leopold that the world viewed his son as a miraculous curiosity, not a permanent fixture. In March 1773, Wolfgang and Leopold crossed the border back into the Archbishopric of Salzburg. The Italian sun was behind them, replaced by the grey skies of the Austrian Alps. The boy who had left as a child was now 17, a young man of immense experience and growing frustration. He carried with him the title of knight and the memories of cheering crowds in Milan, but he was returning to a city that felt increasingly like a cage. The old lenient archbishop had died, replaced by the stern and pragmatic Hieronymus Colloredo. Colloredo had little patience for extended absences or the pretensions of a local musician. The teenage ambition that had been stoked by the fires of Italy was about to collide with the rigid feudal reality of service. The wonder years were over. The struggle for autonomy had begun. Chapter 5, Frustration in Salzburg, 1773-1777. The year is 1773. The grand applause of Milan and the warm embrace of the Italian aristocracy have faded into a distant, taunting memory. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, now a young man of 17, finds himself back in the provincial confines of Salzburg. The transition from a celebrated prodigy touring the capitals of Europe to a salaried employee of a small ecclesiastical court is abrupt and jarring. The narrow streets of Salzburg, nestled beneath the imposing fortress of Hohensalzburg, feel less like a home and more like a gilded cage. The air here is thick with tradition and piety, but thin on the operatic fervour that fuels Wolfgang's soul. He is no longer the miracle child who sat on the lap of Empress Maria Theresa. He is now merely the third concertmaster of the court orchestra, a servant subject to the whims of a new and formidable master. That master is Prince Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo. Elected in 1772, Colloredo is a man of the Enlightenment, a reformer determined to modernize the archaic structures of the Salzburg Church. However, his method of modernization is one of austerity and rigid discipline. He views music not as a vehicle for sublime emotional expression, but as a functional necessity of the liturgy, one that should be brief and efficient. He institutes a rule that an entire Mass, including the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, the Epistle Sonata, the Offertory and the Motet, must last no longer than 45 minutes. For a composer of Wolfgang's expansive imagination, this restriction is suffocating. The friction is immediate and palpable. Colloredo sees a subordinate who requires discipline. Wolfgang sees a tyrant who lacks taste. The salary for his position is 150 florins a year, a pittance that barely covers the cost of maintaining the appearance required of his station. But the financial constraints are secondary to the artistic ones. Salzburg has no permanent opera house, and opera is the lifeblood of Wolfgang's ambition. He craves the drama of the stage, the complex interplay of characters, and the thunderous acclaim of a sophisticated public. In Salzburg, he is relegated to writing church sonatas and serenades for local festivities. The tension in the Mozart household begins to rise. Leopold Mozart, ever the pragmatic father and manager, senses his son's growing volatility. He knows that Wolfgang's talent is too volatile to be contained within the city walls indefinitely, yet he fears the loss of the steady, albeit meagre income that the court provides. In the summer of 1773, father and son make a desperate bid for freedom. They travel to Vienna, the imperial capital, hoping to secure a post at the court of Empress Maria Theresa. The city is vibrant, a stark contrast to the sleepy rhythms of Salzburg. They attend masquerades, visit old patrons, and maneuver through the complex web of Viennese high society. However, the ghost of Wolfgang's childhood fame works against him. The novelty of the wunderkind has worn off, leaving behind a young adult who does not quite fit into the rigid hierarchies of the established musical elite. The Empress, though cordial, is advised by her ministers that the Mozarts constitute useless people who travel about like beggars. The stinging rejection is absolute. There is no position for him in Vienna. Defeated, they return to Salzburg in late September. Yet, it is precisely this compression of spirit, this crushing weight of rejection and confinement, that triggers a profound metamorphosis in Wolfgang's music. Upon his return, in late 1773, he composes the Symphony No. 25 in G minor. It is a work of startling intensity, unlike anything he has written before. Scholars often associate this piece with the Sturm und Drang, or Storm and Stress movement, a proto-romantic surge of emotion in German arts. The symphony opens with syncopated violins and a jagged, piercing oboe line that speaks not of courtly grace, but of urgent, personal turmoil. It is the sound of a young man screaming against the silence of his circumstances. The key of G minor, rarely used by Wolfgang, becomes a vessel for tragedy and agitation. In this music, we hear the first true voice of the mature Mozart, complex, dark, and unflinchingly human. As the months drag into 1774 and 1775, the routine of Salzburg reasserts itself. Wolfgang performs his duties, but his mind is elsewhere. He finds solace in a sudden explosion of productivity focused on the violin. Though he prefers the piano, he is an accomplished violinist, and in 1775, often called his Year of the Violin, he composes 5 concertos for the instrument in rapid succession. These works, particularly the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, are radiant with a light that belies his professional unhappiness. They are innovative, replacing the stiff Baroque structures with a conversational Galant style. The fifth concerto, known as the Turkish, introduces exotic, percussive elements into the finale, a rebellious flash of wit and theatricality inserted into a formal genre. It is as if he is creating his own world where the rules of the Archbishop do not apply. By 1776, the situation with Archbishop Colloredo deteriorates from professional disagreement to open hostility. The Archbishop is frequently absent from Salzburg, yet he refuses to grant the Mozarts permission to travel, effectively holding them prisoner. Wolfgang turns 20. He watches as his contemporaries in other cities secure prestigious appointments and commissions. His correspondence from this period is littered with scatological humour and bitter sarcasm, a psychological defence mechanism against the indignity of his position. He writes to his friend Padre Martini in Bologna, lamenting that he lives in a land where music has no success. He describes the court musicians as gamblers and drunkards, isolating himself further in an ivory tower of his own intellectual superiority. The artistic culmination of this stifling period arrives in January of 1777 with the Piano Concerto No. 9 in E-flat major, known as the Jeune Homme. Written for a visiting French virtuoso, Victoire Genami, this piece shatters the conventions of the classical concerto. It is massive in scale, operatic in its emotional scope, and demands a level of technical prowess that few in Salzburg could appreciate, let alone perform. The second movement is a tragic aria for the piano, filled with a sorrow so deep it seems to anticipate the struggles of the Romantic-era composers who would follow half a century later. It is a masterpiece forged in the fires of frustration, a declaration that while his body might be bound to Salzburg, his genius has long since outgrown it. The breaking point is inevitable. In the summer of 1777, Wolfgang can take no more. He drafts a petition to the Archbishop requesting his release from employment so that he might seek his fortune elsewhere. The language is polite, adhering to the strict protocols of court etiquette, but the subtext is one of desperate urgency. Leopold, fearing for his own position, tries to mitigate the damage, but the Archbishop has grown tired of the Mozarts' constant agitation. Colloredo's response is swift and humiliating. He dismisses both father and son. Leopold, terrified of losing his pension and plunging the family into destitution, is forced to beg for his job back. He is reinstated, but on the condition that he does not leave Salzburg. This creates a painful schism. For the first time, Wolfgang must face the world without his father by his side. It is decided that his mother, Anna Maria, will accompany him on this new journey. The carriage is packed. The mood is heavy with the gravity of the gamble they are taking. They're trading the suffocating security of Salzburg for the complete unknown. As September 1777 arrives, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart resigns himself to the road once more. He leaves behind the G minor symphony, the violin concertos, and the Jeune Homme, monuments to a brilliance that Salzburg could neither understand nor contain. The carriage wheels begin to turn, carrying him toward Mannheim and Paris, toward tragedy and liberation, as the fortress of Hohensalzburg fades into the mist behind him. Chapter 6. Mannheim and Paris, A Search for Fortune, 1777-1778. The morning of September 23, 1777, marked a decisive fracture in the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. At 21 years of age, the former child prodigy had grown into a restless young man, suffocating under the provincial restrictions of Salzburg and the imperious rule of Archbishop Colloredo. Having formally petitioned for his release from service, a request the Archbishop granted with a humiliating eagerness, Mozart was now unemployed, unmoored, and embarking on a journey that was less a grand tour and more a desperate hunt for subsistence. Unlike the glittering triumphs of his childhood, where he was paraded before kings as a biological miracle, this journey carried a heavy weight of expectation. His father, Leopold, remained behind in Salzburg, shackled by his own duties and financial precariousness, forced to mortgage the family's stability on the gamble of his son's success. Instead, Wolfgang was accompanied by his mother, Anna Maria. She was there as a chaperone, a caretaker, and a living tether to the paternal authority waiting anxiously back home. The carriage wheels ground against the dirt roads leading toward Munich, but it was in Mannheim that the true drama of this chapter began to unfold. Arriving in late October, Mozart found himself in a city that pulsed with a musical vitality unlike anything in Europe. Mannheim was the seat of Elector Karl Theodor, a ruler who valued the arts with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Here, Mozart encountered the famous Mannheim Orchestra, an ensemble so disciplined and technically proficient that the music historian Charles Burney had referred to it as an army of generals. For a composer of Mozart's sensitivity, the experience was visceral. He witnessed their signature orchestral effects, the famous Mannheim steamroller, a crescendo that rose from a whisper to a roar with terrifying precision. The exposure to this symphonic power reshaped his understanding of instrumental possibility, planting seeds that would germinate in his later symphonies. He befriended the orchestra's leader, Christian Cannabich, and for a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed that a position at the electoral court was within reach. However, despite the mutual admiration between the musicians and the young composer, the elector offered no permanent employment. The suspense of waiting for an appointment that never materialized began to gnaw at the traveller's limited funds. As winter settled over Mannheim, the narrative of Mozart's journey shifted from professional ambition to personal infatuation. He was introduced to the Weber family, a brood of struggling musicians led by the bass singer and copyist Fridolin Weber. Among Fridolin's daughters was the 16-year-old Aloysia, a soprano of striking ability and allure. Wolfgang, whose heart was as susceptible as his ear was discerning, fell deeply and rapidly in love. He began to neglect his composition of quartets and concertos, dedicating his hours instead to teaching Aloysia and dreaming of an improbable future. In a fever of naivety, he wrote to his father proposing a bohemian plan. He would abandon the search for a court position and instead travel to Italy with the Webers, writing operas to showcase Aloysia's voice. The reaction from Salzburg was volcanic. Leopold's letters from this period vibrate with a fury that transcends the page. He saw his son's proposal not as a romantic gesture, but as a catastrophic dereliction of duty. The family was sliding into debt. The goal was to secure a salary, not to subsidize a penniless family of copyists. Leopold's command was absolute and scathing. Wolfgang was to leave Mannheim immediately. He was to proceed to Paris, the great capital of fashion and taste, where he must re-establish his reputation and make his fortune. The dream of Italy was crushed. Chastened and sullen, Wolfgang boarded the carriage once more in March 1778, tearing himself away from Aloysia. The journey to Paris took 9 grueling days, and the city that awaited them was far removed from the welcoming warmth of Mannheim. Paris in the spring of 1778 was a harsh, indifferent metropolis. Wolfgang and Anna Maria lodged in a dark, uncomfortable room that offered little respite from the city's grime. The 22-year-old composer found the French aristocracy changed. The novelty of the wunderkind had long since evaporated, leaving him to navigate a labyrinth of social protocols and dismissive patrons. He was forced to give lessons in composition to wealthy dilettantes to survive, a task he found degrading and tedious. He complained bitterly of the French taste in music, describing their singing as screeching and their instrumental style as hollow. Yet, amidst this professional alienation, he produced a work of calculated brilliance, the Symphony No. 31 in D major, known as the Paris. It was designed specifically to please the Parisian audience at the Concert Spirituel, utilizing the large orchestra to create a grand, noisy opening, the premier coup d'archet that the French adored. It was a success, but a solitary one. It did not lead to the coveted court appointment at Versailles. The tension of the narrative tightened significantly in May as Anna Maria's health began to falter. The strain of the journey, the miserable living conditions, and the constant anxiety over money had taken a severe toll on the 57-year-old woman. What began as a minor ailment rapidly escalated into a feverish crisis. Wolfgang, isolated in a foreign land where he struggled with the language and the customs, found himself assuming the role of nurse. The medical treatments of the era, bloodletting and purgatives, likely hastened her decline. By mid-June, the situation was dire. The letters Wolfgang wrote during these weeks are studies in suppression. He shielded Leopold from the full gravity of the situation, perhaps fearing his father's blame, or perhaps unable to articulate the encroaching horror. On the night of July 3rd, 1778, the inevitable struck. Anna Maria Mozart died in the cramped Parisian lodging, with only her son by her side. The psychological blow to Wolfgang was catastrophic. He was 22, alone in a hostile city, having failed to secure a job, and now responsible for the death of the mother entrusted to his care. The immediate aftermath required a deception that highlights the terrified dynamic between father and son. Wolfgang could not bring himself to tell Leopold the truth immediately. Instead, he wrote a letter to a family friend in Salzburg, Abbe Bullinger, detailing the death and imploring him to break the news gently to Leopold. Simultaneously, he wrote to his father, claiming Anna Maria was gravely ill but still alive, a fabrication designed to buy time for Bullinger to act. When the truth finally crossed the distance between Paris and Salzburg, the recriminations were implicit and heavy. Leopold's grief was compounded by his belief that Wolfgang's incompetence and dawdling in Mannheim had led to this tragedy. The remainder of Mozart's time in Paris was a ghostly existence. He stayed with the diplomat Baron von Grimm, a former patron who now viewed the young composer as a burden. Grimm eventually orchestrated Mozart's departure, practically pushing him out of the city in September 1778. The return journey was a slow, mournful retreat. Mozart, now carrying the weight of his mother's death and his own professional failure, delayed his return to Salzburg as long as possible. He stopped in Munich, harbouring a fragile hope of reuniting with Aloysia Weber. The reunion in Munich provided the final, stinging humiliation of his independent venture. Aloysia, now employed as a prima donna at the Munich Opera, had moved on. The narrative accounts suggest a scene of painful rejection. When Wolfgang entered the room, she acted as if she barely recognized him, her manner cool and distant. The boy she'd flirted with in Mannheim was now a failed musician in mourning. She, a rising star. Legend holds that Mozart, masking his devastation with bravado, sat at the piano and sang a song instructing those who did not want him to lick his backside. It was a moment of bitter defiance, but the reality was inescapable. He had no choice but to return to the cage. In January 1779, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart arrived back in Salzburg. The journey of 1777 to 1778 had been a disaster in every quantifiable metric. He had spent a small fortune, earned almost nothing, failed to find a new employer, lost his mother, and had his heart broken. He returned to the service of the Archbishop, accepting a position as court organist, a role he loathed. Yet, the young man who returned was fundamentally different from the one who had left. The suffering of Paris and the heartbreak of Munich had stripped away his childish vanity. The search for fortune had yielded no gold, but it had forged a steely, darker maturity in his character. He was now a man who understood loss, a crucial ingredient for the profound, shadow-draped masterpieces that were yet to come. Chapter 7. Breaking Free. The move to Vienna, 1781. Vienna, March, 1781. The sprawling imperial capital of the Habsburg monarchy was a city of contrasts, where the opulent palaces of the aristocracy cast long shadows over the bustling, muddy streets of the common folk. Into this cauldron of ambition and intrigue rode Archbishop Colloredo of Salzburg, and in his retinue, treated with no more ceremony than a valet or a cook, was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was 25 years old. He had already composed masterpieces that would endure for centuries, yet here, in the intoxicating atmosphere of Vienna, he was merely a servant in livery, bound by feudal obligation to a master who neither understood nor respected his genius. This chapter chronicles the volatile weeks that shattered the chains of Salzburg and birthed the first independent musical career in history. The conflict began almost immediately upon their arrival. Colloredo, perhaps sensing the dangerous allure Vienna held for his talented subordinate, sought to keep Mozart on a tight leash. The Archbishop lodged his entourage at the House of the Teutonic Knights, a sombre building that felt more like a barracks than a home for artists. Mozart's letters home to his father, Leopold, during these initial weeks vibrate with suppressed rage. He described his dining arrangements with stinging precision. He was seated at the servants' table, placed above the cooks but below the valets. For a man who had been feted by kings and queens across Europe, who had sat on the lap of the Empress Maria Theresa as a child, this degradation was intolerable. He wrote that he felt he was losing honour every hour he remained in such a position. The true source of friction, however, was not merely the seating chart, but the restriction of opportunity. Vienna was alive with music. The Emperor Joseph II was a keen musical patron, and the city's salons were hungry for virtuosos. Mozart knew that a single concert at the piano could earn him more in one evening than his entire annual salary from the Archbishop. Yet, Colloredo forbade it. When the Russian nobility and the Emperor himself expressed a desire to hear Mozart play, the Archbishop refused permission. He viewed Mozart not as a cultural asset to be shared, but as a piece of property to be hoarded. The tension in the Teutonic house grew toxic. Mozart described the Archbishop using terms that would have been treasonous if spoken aloud. An arrogant, conceited priest who despised anyone with talent. Throughout April and May of 1781, the situation deteriorated from professional disagreement to personal warfare. The Archbishop, frustrated by Mozart's sullen defiance and persistent requests to perform, began to lash out with verbal abuse. In meetings, he called the composer a villain, a wretch, and a dissolute fellow. He told Mozart he was the most slovenly guy he knew. These insults, delivered by a prince of the church to a man conscious of his own supreme worth, severed the last strands of loyalty. Mozart, trembling with indignation, finally requested his discharge. The Archbishop refused to grant it, leaving Mozart in a terrified limbo, technically employed, but emotionally and professionally in open rebellion. The breaking point arrived in early June. Mozart, having been denied a formal dismissal, attempted to present his case again. He went to the Archbishop's residence to deliver a memorial letter. In the antechamber, he was intercepted by Count Arco, the Archbishop's chief chamberlain. Arco was a man caught in the middle, likely instructed by Leopold Mozart to keep Wolfgang in check, but also under pressure from the Archbishop to maintain order. The encounter was violent and shocking. Arco did not merely refuse the letter, he heaped abuse upon the composer, calling him a clown and a knave. When Mozart persisted, demanding his rights, the altercation turned physical. In a moment of high drama that has become legendary in music history, Count Arco literally kicked Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart out of the room. This kick on the backside, as Mozart later described it with visceral clarity, was the definitive end of his service to Salzburg. It was a physical manifestation of the feudal system ejecting the modern artist. Mozart was incensed. He wrote to his father that he would return the kick to Arco if he ever saw him on the street, even if he had to do it in the middle of a procession. But beneath the anger was a profound sense of liberation. The cord was cut. He was no longer the servant of the Archbishop of Salzburg. He was Mozart of Vienna. The immediate aftermath was a period of frantic uncertainty. Leopold Mozart, writing from Salzburg, was apoplectic with fear. He bombarded his son with letters, begging, threatening, and cajoling him to apologize and return to service. Leopold saw only ruin in independence. He believed that without a court appointment, a musician was nothing. But Wolfgang stood firm against the immense psychological pressure of his father. He replied with a newfound steel in his character, declaring that he would rather beg for his bread than serve such a master again. He told Leopold that the time for being a servant was over. Mozart moved out of the Teutonic house, and fatefully took lodging with the Weber family. Fridolin Weber had died, leaving his widow Cecilia and her daughters in precarious financial straits. The choice of residence caused scandals in Salzburg. Leopold was convinced Cecilia was trying to trap Wolfgang into marriage with one of her daughters, but for Wolfgang, the chaotic, boisterous Weber household offered a sanctuary from the rigid protocol of the court. Here, in a rented room in the city centre, he began his life as a freelance musician. The risks were astronomical. In 1781, the concept of a freelance composer was virtually non-existent. Musicians lived by patronage. They were employees. To survive on the open market, selling lessons, compositions, and concert tickets was a gamble of the highest order. Yet the atmosphere of Vienna in that first summer of freedom was intoxicating. Mozart hustled. He took on wealthy pupils, including the Countess Thun, who became a vital ally. He worked the social network of the city, charming the nobility not as a servant, but as a gentleman of talent. His confidence was quickly rewarded. The public appetite for his music was voracious. He began working on a German opera, Die Entführung aus dem Serail, or The Abduction from the Seraglio, a project that would eventually cement his fame in the city. The Emperor Joseph II, free from the interference of the Archbishop, took notice of the young virtuoso. By the winter of 1781, Mozart was engaged in a musical duel with the celebrated pianist Muzio Clementi at the imperial court, a contest staged for the emperor's amusement. While Clementi played with technical brilliance, Mozart played with soul and taste. The emperor, later discussing the event, called Mozart a genius. By the end of 1781, the transformation was total. The terrified young man who had sat below the valets in March was now walking the streets of Vienna as an independent artist, teaching the aristocracy, composing for the emperor, and preparing to revolutionize opera. The kick from Count Arco had not sent him tumbling down. It had propelled him forward into the most creatively fertile decade of his life. He had no guaranteed salary, no pension, and no security, but he possessed something far more valuable: the freedom to follow his own muse. The golden cage of Salzburg was left far behind, and the vast, uncertain, magnificent horizon of Vienna lay before him. Chapter 8: Love, Marriage, and Early Viennese Triumphs, 1782-1785. By the high summer of 1782, the precarious freedom Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had seized in Vienna was teetering on the edge of a domestic crisis. Having severed his professional chains to the Archbishop of Salzburg, the 26-year-old composer now found himself entangled in a different sort of web, one spun not by ecclesiastic authority, but by maternal machination. He was lodging in the home of Cecilia Weber, a widow with 3 unmarried daughters, a situation that polite Viennese society viewed with raised eyebrows and hushed whispers. Years prior, Wolfgang had been infatuated with the eldest daughter, Aloysia, but upon her rejection, his gaze had shifted to the middle sister, Constanze. She was not a celebrated beauty, nor was she the vocal prodigy her sister was, but she possessed a practical resilience and a musical intuition that matched Wolfgang's own chaotic energy. The atmosphere in the Weber household was thick with calculated pressure. Cecilia Weber, seeing a potential provider in the young genius, manoeuvred to secure a commitment. The situation escalated when a rumour, likely fanned by Cecilia herself, circulated that Wolfgang had compromised Constanze's honour. In a moment of panic and coercion, he was forced to sign a document promising to marry Constanze within 3 years or pay a substantial annuity. Though he later tore the paper up, declaring that his word was sufficient, the trap had been sprung. Far away in Salzburg, Leopold Mozart watched these developments with mounting horror. His letters during this period were not merely disapproving, they were venomous. He saw the Webers as parasites intent on draining his son's talent and wallet, diverting Wolfgang from the path of glory Leopold had so carefully charted since the boy's infancy. The tension between father and son reached a breaking point in July of 1782. Wolfgang, desperate to legitimize his relationship and end the gossip, pleaded for his father's consent, a legal necessity for the marriage. Leopold responded with stony silence, withholding his blessing as a weapon of control. But Wolfgang, now tasting the intoxicating agency of adulthood, refused to wait. On the 4th of August, 1782, at St. Stephen's Cathedral, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart married Constanze Weber. The ceremony was a hurried, emotional affair. It is recorded that both bride and groom wept openly, their tears perhaps a mixture of genuine affection and the sheer stress of their defiance. The consent from Leopold arrived in the mail the very next day, too late to stop the union, but just in time to serve as a cold reminder of the rift that had opened between them. Yet, even as his personal life was engulfed in drama, Wolfgang's professional star was ascending with blinding speed. Just weeks before the wedding, on the 16th of July, his new opera, Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Abduction from the Seraglio, had premiered at the Burgtheater. The timing was impeccable. Vienna was in the grip of a fascination with all things Ottoman, a trend known as Turquerie. The opera, set in a Turkish harem, allowed Wolfgang to exploit this exoticism with Janissary music, employing cymbals, triangles, and bass drums to create a raucous, rhythmic vitality that thrilled the Viennese public. The success of Die Entführung was absolute, establishing Mozart not just as a former child prodigy, but as the premier dramatic composer of the German-speaking world. It was a Singspiel, a German-language opera with spoken dialogue, and it challenged the dominance of the Italian opera buffa. The work was complex, demanding extraordinary virtuosity from its singers. It was after a performance of this very work that Emperor Joseph II reportedly offered his famous, equivocal critique. "Too beautiful for our ears, and vastly too many notes, my dear Mozart." To which the composer, emboldened by his triumph, supposedly replied, "Just as many as are necessary, Your Majesty." This exchange, whether apocryphal or factual, perfectly encapsulates the tension of Mozart's early Viennese years, a genius overflowing with invention, colliding with an aristocracy that found his intensity overwhelming. With a wife to support and a lifestyle that leaned toward the extravagant, Mozart threw himself into the role of a freelance artist with terrifying industriousness. The years 1783 through 1785 marked a golden era of performance and composition. Vienna was hungry for piano music, and Mozart was eager to feed it. He organised a series of subscription concerts, known as academies, renting halls and hiring orchestras at his own risk. These were high-stakes gambles where financial ruin was always one empty seat away, yet they proved wildly lucrative. During the Lenten season of 1784 alone, he performed 22 concerts in 38 days, a physical and mental marathon that would have crushed a lesser musician. It was for these concerts that he composed a breathless succession of piano concertos, masterpieces that fundamentally transformed the genre. In works like the Concerto in D minor, K466, and the Concerto in C major, K467, Mozart moved beyond the polite interplay of the gallant style. He created a dramatic dialogue between the soloist and the orchestra, a musical conversation that ranged from operatic tragedy to military pomp. He was the composer, the conductor, and the soloist all at once, his hands flying across the keyboard of his Walter fortepiano, improvising cadenzas that left audiences stunned. He was not merely playing music, he was performing the act of creation in real time. The nobility of Vienna flocked to these events, their carriages clogging the streets outside the Trattenhof and the Mailgruber, pouring florins into the Mozart household, which were spent almost as quickly as they were earned. Domestic life, meanwhile, was a chaotic counterpoint to his public adulation. Wolfgang and Constanze moved frequently, shuffling between apartments in central Vienna, often driven by the need for more space or lower rent. Their marriage was passionate and playful, captured in letters filled with nonsensical riddles and intimate teasing, but it was also touched by the ubiquitous shadow of 18th century mortality. In June of 1783, their first child, Raimund Leopold, was born. The infant lived only 2 months, dying while Wolfgang and Constanze were away in Salzburg, attempting a reconciliation with Leopold, a reconciliation that never truly materialized. The visit was strained. Leopold and his daughter Nannel received Constanze with icy politeness, and the couple returned to Vienna with the realization that Wolfgang's new family would never fully merge with his old one. However, the climax of this period came in the early 1785, when Leopold Mozart finally travelled to Vienna to witness his son's independence firsthand. What he found forced him to suspend his judgment. He saw Wolfgang living in a spacious, albeit expensive, apartment on the Schullerstrasse. He saw the frantic schedule of a man in high demand. But most importantly, he heard the music. On the 12th of February 1785, Leopold attended one of Wolfgang's subscription concerts. The following evening, a string quartet party was held at Wolfgang's home, attended by none other than Joseph Haydn, the most revered composer in Europe. It was in this intimate setting, surrounded by the smoke of pipes and the scraping of Rossini, that Haydn turned to the sceptical father and delivered a verdict that has echoed through history. "Before God and as an honest man," Haydn told Leopold, "I tell you that your son is the greatest composer known to me either in person or by name. He has taste, and furthermore, the most profound knowledge of composition." For Leopold, a man who had staked his entire existence on the cultivation of his son's genius, this was the ultimate vindication. The boy he had dragged across the muddy roads of Europe had conquered the capital of music. Yet beneath the triumph and the applause, the relentless pace was beginning to take its toll, and the volatile economics of a freelance career were a ticking clock that Wolfgang, in his euphoria, chose to ignore. Chapter 9. The Golden Years. Figaro and Don Giovanni, 1786-1787. By the onset of 1786, Vienna was a city simmering with political and artistic intrigue. The 30-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, having established himself as a virtuoso pianist, now turned his gaze toward a more perilous arena, the imperial Italian opera. The genre was dominated by established masters like Salieri and Paisiello, yet Mozart sought to disrupt the status quo. His weapon was a collaboration with a man as unconventional as himself, the libertine priest and poet, Lorenzo da Ponte. Their chosen subject was a scandalous French play by Pierre Beaumarchais, titled The Marriage of Figaro. The play had been banned by Emperor Joseph II for its subversive depiction of servants outwitting their masters, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension before a single note was written. The project was not merely an artistic endeavour, it was a political gamble that could end Mozart's career at the imperial court. The creative process was a feverish race against censors and rival factions. Da Ponte worked to strip the play of its most overt political venom while retaining its dramatic bite, translating the French prose into Italian verse that Mozart could set to music. Throughout the spring of 1786, Mozart composed with a relentless intensity. The result was a score of unprecedented complexity. Unlike the traditional opera buffer, which relied on stock characters and simple melodies, Mozart infused his characters with profound psychological depth. The Count was not merely a villain, but a man consumed by jealousy and power. The Countess was not just a victim, but a figure of noble sorrow. The music demanded more from the singers than they had ever been asked to give, leading to rumours of sabotage and rebellion within the cast during rehearsals. On May 1st, 1786, Le Nozze di Figaro premiered at the Burgtheater in Vienna. The atmosphere in the hall was electric, balanced on a knife edge between triumph and disaster. From the breathless opening overture, it was clear that the audience was witnessing a transformation of the operatic form. The second act finale, a continuous span of music lasting nearly 20 minutes without a break for recitative, left the listeners stunned. As the plot twisted and characters entered and exited, Mozart's music evolved seamlessly, ratcheting up the tension and comedy in equal measure. Despite the intricate nature of the music, the immediate reaction from the public was overwhelming. The applause was so thunderous, and the demands for encores so frequent, that the performance dragged on for nearly double its intended length. However, the Viennese reception was complicated by court politics. While the public cheered, the aristocracy and rival composers viewed the work with suspicion. The success of Figaro was undeniable, yet Emperor Joseph II found the length of the performance, exacerbated by the endless encores, to be excessive. In a bureaucratic move that dampened the opera's momentum in Vienna, the emperor issued a decree shortly after the premiere forbidding the repetition of vocal ensembles, allowing only solo arias to be encored. The opera ran for 9 performances in 1786 before fading from the Viennese schedule, a victim of its own complexity and the fickle nature of the capital's tastes. To Mozart, who knew the value of his creation, the cooling reception in Vienna was a source of bitter frustration. Yet, salvation came from the north. In Prague, the reaction to Figaro was nothing short of fanatical. The Bohemian capital, less stifled by court intrigue than Vienna, embraced the opera with a fervour that bordered on obsession. Reports reached Mozart that the tunes from Figaro were being played in taverns, hummed on the streets, and arranged for wind bands at dance halls. In January 1787, Mozart travelled to Prague to witness this phenomenon firsthand. He wrote to a friend that the people of Prague talked of nothing but Figaro, and played nothing but Figaro. It was during this euphoric visit that the impresario Pasquale Bondini commissioned Mozart to write a new opera specifically for the Prague audience, to be premiered the following autumn. This commission would lead to the darkest and most ambitious work of his life. Returning to Vienna, Mozart reconnected with Da Ponte to select a subject for this new commission. They settled on the legend of Don Juan, the unrepentant seducer who is dragged to hell by a stone statue. The subject matter was darker, shifting the tone from pure comedy to what they termed a dramma giocoso, a mix of jest and serious drama. However, as Mozart began work on Don Giovanni in the spring of 1787, his personal life was struck by tragedy. His father, Leopold Mozart, the man who had shaped his entire existence and with whom he had a complicated, often strained relationship, died in Salzburg on May 28th. The shadow of this loss crept into the score. The music for the Commendatore, the father figure who returns from the grave to judge the libertine, carries a terrified weight and supernatural grandeur that suggests Mozart was grappling with the ghost of his own father. The composition of Don Giovanni continued through the summer and into the autumn, with Mozart completing the bulk of the work in Vienna, before travelling to Prague in October to oversee rehearsals. The final days before the premiere have become the stuff of legend. It is a documented fact that Mozart delayed writing the overture until the very last moment. According to the accounts of his wife Constanze on the night before the premiere, facing a deadline that seemed impossible, Mozart sat up through the night drinking punch while she told him stories to keep him awake. He wrote the overture in a single sitting, the ink barely dry when the copyists arrived in the morning to distribute the parts to the orchestra. The musicians had to sight-read the overture at the premiere, adding a layer of frantic energy to the performance that perfectly suited the music's urgency. On October 29th, 1787, Don Giovanni premiered at the Estates Theatre in Prague. The opera began with the ominous D minor chords of the overture, signalling to the audience that this was no ordinary comedy. The drama unfolded with relentless momentum, portraying the seductive charm of Don Giovanni and the varied suffering of his victims. But it was the finale that shattered musical conventions. As the statue of the Commendatore crashed into the Don's dining hall, accompanied by trombones and terrifying dissonances, the audience was gripped by a soundscape that depicted the very opening of hell. Mozart used chromaticism and volume to create a sense of supernatural dread that had never before been heard in an opera house. The Prague audience, sophisticated and appreciative, roared their approval. It was the pinnacle of Mozart's operatic career, a moment where his genius was fully recognized and celebrated without reservation. The years 1786 and 1787 marked the absolute zenith of Mozart's creative output in the operatic realm. In the span of just 24 months, he had redefined the possibilities of the art form, elevating the opera buffer from light entertainment to a vehicle for deep human insight and metaphysical drama. He had conquered Prague and left an indelible mark on the history of music. However, as the curtain fell on the triumphs of Don Giovanni, the harsh realities of his life in Vienna remained. The financial rewards of these masterpieces were fleeting, and the death of his father severed his last link to his past. Mozart stood at the height of his powers, the undisputed master of his craft, yet he was walking toward a precipice of financial instability and declining health that would define his final years. Chapter 10: Decline and Financial Strain, 1788-1790. The year 1788 dawned over Vienna with a palpable shift in the atmosphere, casting a long grey shadow over the imperial capital. The exuberance that had characterized the early years of the decade, the years of Mozart's meteoric rise as a piano virtuoso, was systematically dismantling itself. The primary catalyst was geopolitical. The Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II had engaged Austria in a costly and disastrous war against the Ottoman Empire. This conflict acted as a vacuum, sucking the vitality and, more importantly, the liquidity out of the Viennese economy. For a freelance musician like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the economic contraction was catastrophic. The aristocracy, the very lifeblood of his patronage, retreated. Many young noblemen were drafted into the officer corps and sent to the front lines. Those who remained in the city grew conservative with their spending, retreating to their country estates to ride out the uncertainty. The concert halls fell silent. The subscription concerts, which had once seen Mozart personally handing out tickets to the elite for substantial profit, simply ceased to exist due to a lack of subscribers. The cultural hunger of Vienna had been replaced by the austere realities of war provisions and inflation. In this climate of austerity, the reception of Don Giovanni in Vienna in May 1788 proved lukewarm at best. While it had been a sensation in Prague, the Viennese public found the music difficult and the themes perhaps too dark for a city already on edge. The emperor reportedly remarked that the music was too difficult for the teeth of my Viennese, to which Mozart famously replied, "Give them time to chew on it." But time was a luxury Mozart could ill afford. His income plummeted just as his family's medical expenses began to rise, with his wife Constanzi suffering from a series of debilitating ailments that required expensive spa treatments in Baden. By the summer of 1788, the financial strain had metamorphosed into a desperate crisis. Evidence of this decline is preserved in a series of heart-wrenching letters addressed to his fellow Freemason and merchant, Michael Puchberg. The tone of these letters is a stark departure from the confident, sometimes arrogant correspondence of his youth. Mozart, the genius of Europe, was reduced to begging. "If you, my best of friends, do not help me," he wrote in June, "I shall lose my credit and my honour, the only things I have left." He requested loans not for luxuries, but for the barest necessities, promising repayment from income that was becoming increasingly hypothetical. To reduce living costs, the Mozart family abandoned their central Vienna residence for a cheaper garden apartment in the suburb of Alsergrund. While the fresh air was beneficial for Constanze, the move geographically isolated Mozart from the centres of influence and the casual networking that occurred in the city centre's coffeehouses and salons. Yet, in this period of acute anxiety and isolation, his creative mind did not atrophy. It accelerated. In the span of just 6 weeks during the summer of 1788, Mozart composed his final 3 symphonies, number 39, number 40, and number 41, the Jupiter. There is no record of these monumental works being performed in his lifetime. They were likely intended for a concert series that never materialized, standing as silent, towering testaments to his resilience, artistic perfection forged in the fires of personal chaos. By the spring of 1789, with Vienna offering no reprieve, Mozart decided to look north. Prince Karl Lichnowsky, a patron and friend, invited Mozart to accompany him on a journey to Berlin, the capital of Prussia. It was a gamble. Mozart hoped to secure a position at the court of King Frederick William II, a monarch known to be a lover of the cello. Leaving Constanze behind, Mozart departed in April 1789. The tour was grueling, a relentless circuit of travel over rough roads that took him through Prague, Dresden, and Leipzig. In Dresden, he played at court, engaging in a musical duel of sorts with the virtuoso J.W. Hessler, asserting his dominance on the keyboard. In Leipzig, a moment of profound musical connection occurred at the St. Thomas Church. Mozart performed on the organ once played by Johann Sebastian Bach. The cantor, Johann Friedrich Dahles, a former student of Bach, was reportedly moved to tears, and for a brief moment, the legacy of the Baroque master communed with the classical genius. Mozart was introduced to Bach's motets, marvelling at the complex counterpoint, exclaiming, "Now here is something one can learn from." However, the primary objective, Berlin, proved to be a disappointment. While he did play for the King and Queen of Prussia in May 1789, and was reportedly offered a commission for a set of string quartets and piano sonatas, no lucrative permanent position was offered. The legend that he turned down a massive salary out of loyalty to the Austrian Emperor is likely a fabrication. The reality was far starker. He received a modest sum, likely 100 Friedrichsdor, which barely covered his travel expenses and the debts he had accrued back home. He returned to Vienna in June 1789, empty-handed, walking back into the very same trap of debt and despondency he had tried to escape. The situation deteriorated further as the decade closed. In February 1790, Emperor Joseph II died. For all his critiques of Mozart's music, Joseph had been a stable protector and a source of sporadic income. His successor, Leopold II, was far less interested in the arts and viewed the previous regime's favourites with suspicion. Mozart was not asked to contribute to the official funeral music, nor was he invited to the new emperor's coronation festivities later in the year. This snub was a clear signal of his falling status at court. Desperate to remain relevant and visible, Mozart decided to travel to Frankfurt for the coronation of Leopold II in October 1790, entirely at his own expense. To finance this trip, he was forced to take the humiliating step of pawning his silverware. The journey was a final, frantic attempt to assert his place in the European musical hierarchy. He brought with him the Piano Coronation Concerto K537, hoping to dazzle the international dignitaries gathered in the city. The Frankfurt venture was a failure. The city was overcrowded, the public was distracted by the pomp and ceremony of the coronation, and Mozart's private academy concert was poorly attended. The receipts were negligible. he wrote to Constanze, trying to maintain a brave face, but the underlying tone was one of exhaustion. He travelled on to Mainz, Mannheim and Munich, performing where he could, but the grand triumphs of his youth were not repeated. He returned to Vienna in November 1790, physically depleted and financially ruined. The world seemed to be moving on without him. The Rococo era was dying. The fires of the French Revolution were burning in the West, and in Vienna, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart faced the winter of 1790 staring into an abyss of uncertainty, unaware that the final frantic year of his life was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Clarinet and Final Flourish, 1791. The year 1791 arrived not with the silence of a fading career, but with the thunderous intensity of a final desperate sprint. At 35 years old, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart stood at a peculiar precipice. While his finances remained precarious and his debts to friends and moneylenders loomed like storm clouds, his creative faculties had entered a state of hyperactivity. It was as if the composer, consciously or unconsciously sensing the encroaching limits of his mortality, sought to empty his mind of every melody it held before the end. This final year was not merely a period of productivity. It was a miraculous resurgence that would bestow upon the world works of profound depth and innovative theatricality. Central to this late bloom was Mozart's deep friendship with the clarinet virtuoso Anton Stadler. Stadler, a fellow Freemason, possessed a mastery over the bassett clarinet, an instrument with an extended lower range, that captivated Mozart's imagination. While their collaboration had yielded the exquisite clarinet quintet 2 years prior, it was in the autumn of 1791 that this partnership reached its zenith with the composition of the Clarinet Concerto in A major, K622. This concerto stands as a singular monument in the woodwind repertoire. It lacks the trumpets and timpani of his grand symphonies, relying instead on a softer, more intimate orchestration that allows the solo instrument to weave a narrative of aching beauty. The second movement, the Adagio, is often cited by musicologists as one of the most sublime creations in Western art music. Here, the music transcends mere technical display. It floats with a tranquil, almost otherworldly resignation. It is objective fact that Mozart wrote this piece for a specific friend, yet the emotional resonance suggests a personal confession, a serene acceptance of life's twilight, written by a man who was himself fading. Simultaneously, Mozart was engaged in a project that diverged sharply from the aristocratic operas of his past. He reconnected with an old acquaintance, Emanuel Schikaneder, the director of a troupe of actors performing at the theatre of Wieden in the suburbs of Vienna. Schikaneder commissioned Mozart to write a Singspiel, a German-language opera with spoken dialogue, that would appeal to a broader, more popular audience. The result was Die Zauberflöte, or The Magic Flute. Unlike the courtly intrigues of The Marriage of Figaro, this work was a fantastical allegory, steeped in fairy tale imagery, yet underpinned by heavy Masonic symbolism. The plot, following the trials of Prince Tamino and the birdcatcher Papagino, serves as a metaphor for the Masonic journey from darkness into light, emphasizing the virtues of silence, steadfastness, and wisdom. To ensure Mozart's focus, Schikaneder provided him with a small wooden pavilion, a garden hut known as the Zauberflötenhäuschen, near the theatre. Here, isolated from the domestic chaos of central Vienna, Mozart worked with feverish speed. The score he produced is a bafflingly brilliant synthesis of styles. It juxtaposes the simple, folk-like strophic songs of Papageno with the stratospheric, Italianate coloratura of the Queen of the Night, and the solemn, choral-like fugues of the priests. The overture alone, with its 3 majestic opening chords, signals the Masonic significance of the number 3, a motif that recurs rhythmically and structurally throughout the opera. The music does not merely accompany the drama, it elevates a somewhat chaotic libretto into a cohesive spiritual testament. During the composition of The Magic Flute, the physical toll on Mozart became increasingly visible. Witnesses from this period describe a man operating on nervous energy, his complexion greying, his movements occasionally erratic. He was prone to fainting spells and periods of dark depression, which he attempted to counter with manic bursts of work. In late August of 1791, he was compelled to travel to Prague for the coronation of Emperor Leopold II as King of Bohemia, for which he had been commissioned to write yet another opera, La Clemenza di Tito. The journey was arduous. Mozart fell ill in Prague, and his acquaintances there noted his pallor and lack of appetite. He returned to Vienna in mid-September, exhausted, only to dive immediately back into the final rehearsals for The Magic Flute. The premiere of The Magic Flute took place on September 30th, 1791. Mozart conducted from the keyboard, with Scicanida himself playing the role of Papageno. The initial reception was lukewarm, confusing some of the audience with its rapid shifts between low comedy and high ritual. However, as the run continued through October, the opera gained immense traction. It became a genuine popular hit. In his letters to his wife Constanze, who was taking a cure at the Spa in Baden, Mozart chronicled his visits to the theatre with almost childlike delight. He detailed the audience's reactions, counting the encores and noting the silent approval that meant more to him than applause. This success offered a glimmer of hope for his financial recovery, a cruel irony given the rapid deterioration of his physical state. As the autumn leaves began to fall in Vienna, the contrast between Mozart's artistic vitality and his biological decay became stark. He had completed the clarinet concerto in early October, mere days after the Magic Flute premiere. It was his last completed major instrumental work, the fluid lines of the clarinet dipping into the chalumeau register and soaring into the altissimo mimic the human voice in a way that feels almost conversational, a final dialogue between the composer and the world he was preparing to leave. There is no rage in this music, only a pervasive golden luminosity. It is the work of a man in full command of his powers, yet the hand that penned the score was trembling. By November, the suspense regarding his health had shifted from a background concern to an acute crisis. The final flourish of 1791 was drawing to a close, and the silence of the sick room was beginning to replace the applause of the theatre. Chapter 12, The Requiem and the End, 1791. By the autumn of 1791, the atmosphere in Vienna had turned crisp and cold, mirroring the chilling shift in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's existence. He was 35 years old, a man who had traversed the courts of Europe as a child prodigy and redefined the operatic stage as an adult. Yet, in these final months, a shadow had lengthened over his life, a shadow cast not by a lack of success, for his latest opera, The Magic Flute, was playing to rapturous audiences, but by a physical and psychological decay that seemed to arrive with the suddenness of a winter storm. The genesis of this final tragic chapter began months earlier, in July, with a knock at the door that has since echoed through history. A stranger, tall and clad entirely in grey, had presented himself to Mozart. He bore an anonymous letter commissioning a requiem mass, a funeral service for the dead. The messenger refused to reveal the identity of his patron, warning Mozart not to seek the author's name. We now know this patron was Count Franz von Walsegg, an aristocrat with a penchant for commissioning works from established composers and passing them off as his own to honour his late wife. However, to a weary and overworked Mozart, whose constitution was already fraying under the strain of deadlines and financial anxiety, the grey messenger appeared not as a servant of a count, but as an omen from the beyond. He became convinced that he was composing the requiem for his own funeral. Throughout October, Mozart tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. He drove out to the suburbs to pick up his wife, Constanze, who had been taking the cure at Baden and enjoyed the mounting success of the magic flute. He wrote letters full of affection and mundane details, describing his meals and the reactions of the audiences. Yet, beneath this veneer, the poison of illness was working its way through his system. During a walk in the Prater Park with Constanze, the composer was seized by a melancholic certainty. He told her that he sensed he would not last much longer, that someone must have given him poison, aqua toffina, and that his life was measured. The decline accelerated sharply on the 20th of November, 1791. Mozart took to his bed, never to rise again. His symptoms were severe and agonizing. His hands and feet began to swell, a condition known as edema, to the point where his body became so bloated he could barely move. A violent fever raged, accompanied by rashes and a metallic taste in his mouth. The medical diagnosis of the time was Hitziger's Friesel fever, or severe miliary fever, though modern pathology suggests a range of causes from streptococcal infection, leading to kidney failure, to rheumatic fever, or perhaps trichinosis. Whatever the biological agent, the result was a slow, painful dismantling of a genius. Despite the agony, his mind remained, terrifyingly lucid. The race against time had begun. The requiem lay unfinished, a tormenting fragment of divine promise. His pupil, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, sat by his bedside, acting as an amanuensis. Mozart, too weak to hold a quill for long periods, dictated the orchestration, explaining how the timpani should sound in the Dies Irae, or how the voices should weave together in the confutatis. The room, stifling and smelling of sickness and medicine, became the crucible for one of music's greatest mysteries. There is a persistent legend that on the afternoon of December 4th, a few friends gathered around his bed to sing through the completed parts of the work. It is said that Mozart took the alto part, but upon reaching the first few bars of the Lacrimosa, the Day of Tears, he broke down, weeping, and put the score aside, overwhelmed by the realization that he would never hear the Sanctus or the Agnus Dei. As the night of December 4th bled into the early hours of December 5th, the end drew near. His sister-in-law, Sophie Heibel, arrived to find him still conscious but focused entirely on the requiem. He gave final instructions to Süssmayr, his voice a whisper, his breath shallow. He was obsessed with the idea that the performance of the magic flute was happening at that very moment, reportedly glancing at his watch and whispering, "Now the Queen of the Night is appearing." The doctor, Thomas Franz Closet, was summoned from the theatre. He arrived late and ordered cold compresses to be placed on Mozart's burning head. The shock of the cold against his fevered skin caused the composer to shudder violently, and he lost consciousness. At 5 minutes roughly before 1 o'clock in the morning on December the 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart turned to the wall and ceased to breathe. He was 35 years, 10 months, and 8 days old. The aftermath of his death was swift, practical, and stark, stripping away any romantic notions of a glorious exit. Constanze was prostrate with grief, leaving the arrangements to friends and patrons, notably Baron van Swieten. In accordance with the custom of the time and the regulations instituted by Emperor Joseph II to prevent disease and excessive spending, the funeral was a modest affair. On December 6th, the body was taken to St. Stephen's Cathedral. It was placed in the Crucifix Chapel on the northern side, where a brief blessing was given. It was a third-class funeral, costing 8 florins and 56 kreuzer. Neither a pauper's funeral as legend often dictates, nor a burial befitting a knight of the Golden Spur. As the procession moved towards the St. Mark's Cemetery, situated outside the city walls, the myths began to diverge from reality. Romantic biographers later conjured images of a tempestuous storm, snow and rain lashing down, causing the few mourners to turn back at the city gates, leaving the hearse to travel alone. This dramatic, pathetic fallacy served to isolate the genius in death, unloved and abandoned. However, meteorological records from the Vienna Observatory for December 6th and 7th, 1791, tell a different story. The weather was calm, with a light mist and temperatures mild for December. If mourners did not follow the hearse to the grave, it was likely due to local Viennese custom, which dictated that the funeral service at the church ended the public mourning, and the interment was a private matter for the gravediggers. At the cemetery, Mozart was not lowered into a mass pit of anonymous corpses in the sense of a plague pit, but rather a common grave designed for multiple citizens, to be dug up and reused after 10 years. No cross marked the spot, no stone bore his name. The gravedigger, a man whose name is lost to time, covered the coffin with earth, and just like that, the physical vessel of the greatest musical mind in Western history vanished into the Viennese soil. Constanze, perhaps too ill or too grief-stricken, did not visit the grave immediately. When she finally did, years later, the exact location could no longer be identified with certainty. The man who had composed the universe into harmony was left with nothing but the silence of the earth, while his requiem, finished by Süssmayr and others, began its own immortal journey, forever binding the mystery of his death to the magnificence of his final notes. Chapter 13. Legacy. Immortal Echoes. The earth of the St. Mark's Cemetery had scarcely settled when the silence descending upon Vienna began to vibrate with a new, unsettling frequency. It was December 1791. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was dead at the age of 35, leaving behind a mountain of debt, a confused estate, and a widow, Constanze, who was just 29 years old and burdened with 2 young sons. The immediate aftermath of his passing was not filled with the fanfare of a fallen hero, but with the cold, hard reality of survival. The inventory of his possessions listed clothing, books, and a few instruments, but little of liquid value. The true treasure lay in the scattered piles of ink-stained paper that littered his study, scores that contained some of the most profound music ever conceived by the human mind. The narrative of Mozart's life could have ended there, dissolving into the anonymity of a pauper's grave, had it not been for the fierce, calculating determination of the woman he left behind. Constanze Mozart, often unfairly marginalized in earlier historical accounts, emerged as the primary architect of the composer's immortality. In the weeks following the funeral, she found herself in a precarious position. The imperial pension was not guaranteed, and creditors were circling. With a shrewdness born of necessity, she realized that Wolfgang's music was a commodity that required careful management. She did not merely mourn, she mobilized. Her first and most pressing concern was the unfinished requiem. A commission that had already been partially paid for, it represented a vital sum of money that would only be delivered upon the work's completion. The suspense surrounding the requiem was palpable. Constanze approached several associates, swearing them to secrecy, desperate to have the remaining movements fleshed out so she could present the work as finished by her husband. It was eventually Franz Xaver Süssmayr who undertook the task, weaving his own notes with Mozart's sketches so seamlessly that for years the boundaries between the master and the apprentice remained a subject of intense debate. While the requiem provided immediate relief, Constanze looked toward the long term. She began to organize memorial concerts, the first of which took place in January 1793 in Vienna. These were not small, intimate gatherings, but grand affairs designed to cement Wolfgang's status as a titan of composition. She leveraged the guilt and admiration of the Viennese patron class, ensuring that the emperor himself contributed to the benefit concerts. Furthermore, she embarked on a series of aggressive negotiations with publishers. In 1799, she sold a massive tranche of original manuscripts to the publisher Johann Anton André for a substantial sum. This act was critical. It not only secured her financial independence, but also ensured the preservation of the scores. André, a meticulous man, began the process of cataloguing the works, a precursor to the systematic organization that would eventually allow the world to comprehend the sheer volume of Mozart's output. Constanze's efforts effectively transformed the chaotic remnants of a genius into a coherent legacy. As the 19th century dawned, the reputation of the composer began to undergo a metamorphosis. During his life, Mozart was respected but often considered difficult or too complex for the average ear. In death, he became a deity. The rising tide of Romanticism found in Mozart an ideal archetype, the divinely gifted vessel, struck down in his prime, misunderstood by a Philistine world. This narrative, though partially mythologized, fueled an explosion of interest. Joseph Haydn, who had long recognized his friend's superiority, famously remarked to a Prague publisher that posterity would not see such a talent again in 100 years. But it was Ludwig van Beethoven who felt the weight of the legacy most acutely. Arriving in Vienna just a year after Mozart's death, the young Beethoven was told by his patron Count Waldstein that he would receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. Beethoven's early works were heavily indebted to Mozart's structures, and he is said to have been visibly shaken by the perfection of the C minor piano concerto, despairing that he would never be able to compose something so great. The shadow of Mozart stretched long over the Romantic era, influencing everyone from Schubert to Tchaikovsky, who referred to Mozart as the Christ of music. By the mid-19th century, the biography of Mozart began to merge with legend. In 1862, Ludwig von Köchel published the chronological thematic catalogue of the complete musical works of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. This monumental effort gave order to the chaos, assigning the now famous KV numbers to the compositions. It revealed a staggering reality: over 600 completed works in a lifespan of only 35 years. The catalogue underscored the superhuman productivity that defined his existence. Yet, alongside the scholarly appreciation, the tragic myths persisted. The story of Salieri poisoning Mozart, popularized later by Pushkin and Rimsky-Korsakov, and eventually the play and film Amadeus, took root in the cultural consciousness. While historically unfounded, these dramatic embellishments spoke to the world's inability to accept that such a flame could be extinguished by something as mundane as rheumatic fever or kidney failure. The world demanded a dramatic exit for a dramatic life. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the legacy of Mozart transcended music theory and entered the realm of cognitive science. In October 1993, researchers at the University of California, Irvine, published a study suggesting that listening to Mozart's sonata for two pianos in D major, K4, 48, temporarily boosted spatial temporal reasoning performance. The media seized upon this finding, coining the term the Mozart effect. While subsequent studies tempered the claims, arguing that the effect was temporary and not a permanent boost to IQ, the phenomenon highlighted a universal truth. There is something intrinsic in the structure of Mozart's music, a balance, a symmetry, and a clarity that resonates with the human brain on a fundamental level. It is music that sounds inevitable, as if it had always existed and Mozart merely plucked it from the ether. Today, the echoes of his life are ubiquitous. His operas are performed more frequently than those of any other composer. The Salzburg Festival, established in 1920, draws thousands of pilgrims annually to the city of his birth, turning the provincial town he once loathed into a global shrine to his memory. But perhaps the most poignant testament to his immortality lies not on Earth, but in the void of interstellar space. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft, carrying the Golden Record, a time capsule intended to communicate the story of humanity to extraterrestrial intelligences. Among the sounds of Earth, wind, thunder, and greetings in 55 languages, is the Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute. As these probes travel billions of miles away from our sun, entering the darkness of the cosmos, the voice of Mozart continues to sing, a defiant assertion of beauty against the silence of the universe. From a pauper's grave in Vienna to the edge of the solar system, the journey is complete. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is no longer a man. He is a frequency, a standard, and an eternal echo of the absolute capabilities of the human spirit.